A cowboy crossed the snow and gave her a valley. The axe stuck in the round. I left it there. Two cords already split and stacked against the north wall of the cabin, and I wasn't cold. I was just splitting wood because there was nothing else to do, and a man needs something to do with his hands. That was the winter I lived alone at the top of Garnet Creek. 2 years running. No neighbors inside of 12 miles, which suited me fine. The nearest town was a place called Ridley, population maybe 80 on a good day, and I rode down there once a month for flour and salt and whatever else I couldn't do without. I did not have long conversations. I did not stay for supper. I came in, traded, and came back up the mountain before dark, and that was enough society for me. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound like something I wasn't. I wasn't some granite-jawed loner who turned his back on the world out of pride. I was just a man who'd run out of the particular kind of luck that keeps a person tethered to other people. My wife had died of fever 3 years prior. Sarah, a good woman, and I don't say that the way men sometimes say it, meaning she was quiet and didn't bother him much. I mean she was genuinely good, the kind of good you know is rare even while you've got it. And when she was gone, something in me just stopped making the effort. Not in a mournful, dramatic way. More like a clock that winds down slow, and then one day you notice the hands aren't moving. The land was mine. 160 acres running up from the creek to the timber on the north face. I had 22 head of cattle, a good horse named Burl, a roof that didn't leak much, and I knew how to fill a season without wasting it. That was enough. Or I told myself it was enough. Some mornings I believed it. Then came the 23rd of February. I remember the date because I'd been marking the days since Christmas on the cabin doorframe with a jackknife, which is something a man only does when he's keeping himself deliberately occupied and not thinking too hard about why. I was coming down off the ridge on Burl, about 2 hours before dark when I saw the tracks. They came up the east side of the draw, which was the hard way, steep and drifted and mostly only used by deer and the occasional elk. The tracks were small, boots, no horse, someone walking on foot in 2 feet of snow, going uphill toward my place, which made no sense. The stride was wrong too, short and heavy, like someone who was herding or carrying something, and the right boot was dragging just slightly, leaving a shallow groove in the crust. I followed them without deciding to follow them, just turned Burl and went. She was sitting in the snow about 40 yards below my south fence line, leaning against a lodgepole pine, and she was very nearly done. I mean that plainly. Her lips were blue at the edges and her hands had gone past shaking into the stillness that comes after shaking. She had a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders that had gotten wet from the snow and then half frozen and wasn't doing much of anything anymore. She was young, not a girl, but young, maybe 23, 24, and she was very clearly pregnant. 6, 7 months along, I'd have guessed. Not the kind of thing a man misses. I got down off Burl and she looked at me. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask for help or explain herself. She just looked at me with eyes that were past scared and had gotten somewhere quieter than scared, the way a horse looks when it's been run too far and is just waiting to see what comes next. I said, "Can you stand?" She said, "I was standing until a few minutes ago." That was all we said. I got her up, put her on Burl, and led them down to the cabin. The whole way I was watching her to make sure she stayed on, which she did, both hands gripping the saddle horn and her jaw set. She didn't lean forward and she didn't complain. She was upright the whole way. Even then, half frozen and carrying another life inside her and so tired her eyes were barely tracking, she sat up straight. I got her inside. I got the fire up. I got the wet blanket off her and a dry one around her, and I put a pot of water on, and then I stood in my own kitchen not entirely sure what to do next. I had not had a woman in this cabin in 2 years. I had not had any person in this cabin in 6 months. She said, "I don't want to be trouble." I said, "You're not trouble yet, you're just cold." She almost smiled at that, not quite, but almost. Her name was Meek Colton, and she'd walked 11 miles in the snow, which she told me later in a voice so matter-of-fact it took me a minute to understand she wasn't exaggerating. 11 miles from a trapper's camp on the far side of the eastern ridge. A man named Jael Sutter had paid her father $40 for her in October, when she was already 4 months along by a boy in Kansas City who'd since vanished from the earth. Her father was a drunk, and the $40 had seemed like a solution to him. To her, it had seemed like the end of her life. Sutter had kept her all winter at the camp, which was a collection of 3 rough-built shacks and a foul-smelling drying shed, and he had not been kind. I'm not going to put too fine a point on what that means because you already know, and because she didn't dwell on it herself. What I'll tell you is that by February she had decided she'd rather die in the snow than spend another night in that camp, and she'd walked out in the pre-dawn dark and gone 11 miles on a bad ankle. She'd twisted it on ice in January, and it had healed crooked, and she'd made it to within 40 yards of my south fence before she couldn't go any further. She hadn't known whose land it was. She just walked toward the ridge because someone in Ridley had told her once, months back when Sutter brought her to town for supplies, that there was a homestead up on Garnet Creek. She'd held onto that like a coin in a pocket, and she'd walked toward it when she ran out of other choices. I let her sleep in my bed. I slept in the chair. In the morning she was still feverish, not badly, but enough that I wasn't going to put her back in the cold. I made her eat. She ate like someone who'd been careful with food for a long time and wasn't sure she should use up what was in front of her, and that told me more about the last 4 months than anything she'd said. I didn't think much further ahead than the next meal. That was all I was doing, getting her warm, getting her fed, watching the ankle, which was swollen under the wrapping I'd put on it and needed another week of rest before she could walk on it without it being stupid to do so. That was the plan, get her well enough to move, and then, well, I hadn't gotten to, and then. There wasn't a clear and then. The nearest town was 12 miles. The nearest woman who might take her in was a widow named Bertram who ran the dry goods in Ridley and was decent enough but had her own 4 children. The situation was what you might call unresolved. On the 3rd day, me came out of the back room and sat at the table and said, "I need to know if you're going to send me back." I was at the stove. I didn't turn around right away. I said, "Why would I do that?" She said, "Sutter paid for me. He'll say I'm his property." I turned around then. I said, "He's wrong about that." She looked at me for a long moment. She was still pale and the circles under her eyes were dark, and she was wrapped in my second-best blanket, and she looked about as vulnerable as a human being can look. But her eyes were not vulnerable. Her eyes were very clear and very direct, and she was looking at me the way a person looks at something they are trying to judge the truth of. Not suspicious, just careful. She'd learned to be careful. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because you're a person, and this is my land, and he's not welcome on it." She held my eyes for another second. Then she said, "All right," and looked down at her hands. That was the whole conversation. Sutter came on the 5th day. I will tell you about that because it matters. He came up the draw on a big gray mule, Sutter did, with another man riding behind him who I didn't know, a hired hand, or a friend, which at that range of living meant roughly the same thing. Sutter was not a large man, but he was the kind of man who takes up more space than his size accounts for, loud in his movements, decisive in a way that usually means he's used to things going his way. He had a heavy beard and small eyes, and he pulled up in my yard and didn't get down off the mule, which told you something about how he'd planned the conversation. He said my land and my house, that I had his property inside and he'd come to collect it. I was standing on the porch with my rifle on my arm, not raised, just held, and I said that I didn't have his property inside, that I had a woman who'd walked 11 miles to get away from him and was welcome here as long as she chose to stay. He started talking about the $40 and the arrangement with her father. I let him finish. Then I said that no arrangement between men had ever made a woman's body a piece of property, and that I was willing to stand on that position for as long as needed. His friend sort of shifted in his saddle and didn't say anything. Sutter said he'd take this to the law. I said the law was 12 miles away, and he was welcome to go get it. He sat there on the mule for a moment. I didn't move. Then he turned the mule and rode back down the draw, and the hired hand followed, and I watched them until they were out of sight in the timber. My hands were steady the whole time. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't shaking. I was angry, a cold, settled kind of angry that I recognized from a few other moments in my life, but my hands were steady. I went back inside. Me was standing at the side window where she could see the yard. She'd watched the whole thing. She looked at me and I looked at her and I said, "He's gone." She said, "He'll come back." I said, "Let him." She sat down, she put both hands flat on the table and she breathed. Then she said, "Thank you," and it came out low and plain with no decoration on it, and I understood it was not casual thanks. It was the other kind. I went to the stove. My back was to her and I said, "You don't have to thank me, you just have to get well." The ankle took another 12 days. Me was not idle. I want to say that plainly because some people hearing this might assume she was a woman who let herself be kept. She was not. From the morning she could move without wincing, she was up doing whatever the cabin needed done. She had strong hands and she worked fast and without being told what needed doing, which is the mark of someone raised to work. She cooked better than I did, which wasn't hard. I'd been eating like a man who doesn't care what things taste like, which is to say I'd been eating to survive and nothing more. She made things taste like something. She made biscuits that rose right. Small things, but after 2 years of my own cooking, they landed on me like a gift. We talked in the evenings. It came on gradually, the way things do when two people are living in the same small space and one of them needs to get used to trusting again. She'd talk about Kansas City, which she'd come from at 16 with her father after her mother died, and about what it had been like there, and about the boy who'd gotten her with child and vanished. She didn't talk about him with bitterness. She talked about him the way you talk about a mistake you understand now, plainly, without excusing it, without tearing yourself up over it either. She'd been young and he'd seemed solid, and she'd been wrong about that. That was all. I talked about Sarah sometimes. First time in a long while I'd talked about her to anyone. Me listened the way good listeners do, not filling up the silence, not rushing in with something symmetrical from her own life, just listening. It felt strange and not entirely comfortable and also necessary in some way I couldn't name. March came in cold and then got colder. The baby was due in May, she thought, maybe early June. I thought about that. A baby in the cabin. I lay in my chair at night and thought about it without deciding anything, and then I'd fall asleep and not dream much. I'd been not dreaming much for 2 years. Sutter did not come back. I found out later, from a man in Ridley named Pollard who ran the feed and knew everything and couldn't keep any of it to himself, that Sutter had gone to the county sheriff in Calder, which was 30 miles south. The sheriff, whose name was Ames, and who I'd met once and found to be a reasonable man, had told Sutter that he had no legal claim on a woman who'd walked away of her own will, and that if Sutter pressed the matter of the $40, his first conversation would be with me's father, not with me, since the father was the one who'd made the arrangement. Sutter had apparently found this unsatisfying. He'd sold his trapping rights in February and left the territory by April. I heard it secondhand, and I didn't go looking to verify it. It was enough. The weeks moved the way they do when you're not running from anything or toward anything, just living. I fixed the east fence, which had been losing a fight with the elk all winter. I checked the cattle. I cut more wood than I needed and stacked it. Me moved slowly in the last weeks, the way a woman does when she's carrying that much, and she stopped doing the heavy work without being asked and started doing the lighter work without being told, and that was just sense, and she had plenty of it. One evening in late April, I came in from the upper pasture, and she was standing at the west window watching the light go off the peaks, which was something she'd taken to doing in the evenings. The mountains hold the light a certain way in April that they don't hold it any other month, something about the snow still on them and the angle of the sun, and she watched it most nights like it was something she was still getting used to having. She heard me come in and she said, without turning, "Macon, if the baby is a boy, I'd like to call him Daniel." My name is Macon. I should have said that earlier. Macon Dell. I don't know if it matters. Probably it matters a little. I said, "That's a good name." She said, "And if it's a girl, I'd like to call her Ruth." I said, "Also a good name." She turned then and looked at me. She said, "I need to ask you something." I took my coat off and hung it. I said, "All right." She said, "What did you plan for us?" "After the baby." I had thought about this. I want you to know I'd thought about it. But I hadn't said anything because I hadn't been sure it was mine to say. It felt like something she needed to arrive at herself, not something I should hand her like a decision I'd already made. I said, "I hadn't planned past May. I was waiting to see what you wanted." She said, "I want to stay." She said it the same way she'd said thank you that first week, low and plain and not dressed up. She held my eyes when she said it, no question in it, a statement of something she'd already decided. I said, "Then stay." She said, "I'm not asking out of nowhere to go. I want you to understand that. There are places I could go. I've thought about it. I could go to Ridley and work for Mrs. Bertram, and I could raise the baby there. I thought about it a long time." I said I didn't know about that. She said, "I'm staying because of what you are, not because of what I've got nowhere else." I didn't say anything to that. I couldn't think of what to say. I stood in the middle of my own kitchen with my coat hooked behind me and looked at a woman who had walked 11 miles in the snow to get away from a bad situation, and had ended up on my land and had watched me for 2 months the way a careful person watches, and had decided I was worth staying with. A man I hadn't thought much of in a long time. A man I'd been going through the motions of keeping alive, without much particular reason beyond habit. She was still looking at me. She wasn't waiting for an answer. She'd said what she'd come to say, and she was comfortable waiting. I said, "I'm glad you're staying." She nodded. She turned back to the window. The light on the peaks was going gold toward orange, and the shadows were coming down the face of the mountain, and she watched them come down, and I stood there and watched them too. That night I lay in my chair and I thought about things in a different order than I'd been thinking about them. Not with urgency, just differently. Like a hand of cards you've been holding wrong side up and you turn them over. The baby came on the 12th of May. I want to tell you about that morning. Not the whole of it, some of it is hers and not mine to tell, but the part that I carry. It started in the night, around 2 in the morning by my best guess. I knew what was happening because she came and woke me with a hand on my shoulder, which was the first time she'd touched me while I was sleeping, and there was something in how she did it, quiet and sure, not panicked, that told me she'd been awake for a while deciding how she felt about what was coming before she came to get me. I got up and I got water on and I got the fire up and I went to the door and looked out at the night because there was nothing else I could do immediately, and the sky was very clear and very cold, and the stars were the kind you only see at that altitude in that month, close-looking and sharp. I stood there for a minute. I said something to Sarah quietly. I don't know exactly what I said. Something brief. Then I went back inside and got to work. Mrs. Bertram had come up 2 weeks before at my invitation. I'd ridden down and asked her, and she'd come up the next day to meet me and had come back twice since. And I'd sent Burl down to Ridley for her at midnight, and she arrived just before dawn. I was grateful for that. Mrs. Bertram was a capable woman who had done this 4 times herself, and she took over in the way a person takes over when they know what they're doing and you don't. I was put to heating water and staying out of the way, which I did with full commitment. I stayed out of the way very thoroughly. Daniel was born at 7:30 in the morning on the 12th of May, which was a clear day with a strong west wind that smelled like wet grass coming up the mountain, and he came into the world noisy and seemed to plan on staying that way. Mrs. Bertram handed him to me, and me looked at him for a long moment. She looked like someone who's been moving fast for a very long time and has finally set something down. I was in the doorway. Mrs. Bertram looked at me and said, "Come in, Macon, he's not going to break." I came in. Me looked up at me. She looked tired down to the bone, and she looked, there isn't a right word for it, like something in her had settled that had been unsettled for a long time. She held the baby out toward me a little and said, "Come see." I came and looked at Daniel, who was red and furious and very small and already very determined about something. I said, "He's got a good set of lungs." Me said, "He gets that from me." And that was the first time I heard her laugh. Really laugh. It surprised me into laughing too, which surprised Mrs. Bertram, who looked between us with an expression that said she was updating some understanding she'd had about the situation. We were married in Ridley on the 4th of July. This was me's choice of date, which she told me was because she liked the idea of a day that already had a reason to celebrate. I did not argue. Sheriff's man in Calder had confirmed by then that the transaction with her father carried no legal weight. Ames had written me a letter about it in March that was very dry and very precise, and said essentially what I'd told Sutter in the yard that day, which gave me some satisfaction. We stood in Ridley's little frame church, and I said what I meant, and she said what she meant, and Pollard from the feed store cried, which no one had expected, least of all Pollard. We rode back up to Garnet Creek with Daniel in me's arms and the July sun on the high grass and Burl moving easy under me. I had traded for a second horse by then, a brown mare me had named Agnes, which she said with a straight face was a fine name for a horse. I rode next to them and looked out at the land. My land. 160 acres coming green into summer. I had plans for more acreage before winter, a conversation I'd had with Ames who'd put me onto some deeded ground adjacent to the east that the previous owner had abandoned. Plans I hadn't had 6 months before because I hadn't been the kind of man who makes plans for the future when the future seems like just more of the same. Something had changed in me. I want to be honest about what that thing was because I've been thinking about it for a while. It wasn't that me had softened me or made me tender or any of that. She hadn't. I was the same man I'd been when she walked up out of the draw. What she'd done was something different. She'd looked at what I was: methodical, quiet, capable of standing in my yard with a rifle on my arm and telling a man to get off my land without my voice rising once. And she'd said, plainly, that this was a man worth staying with. Not a man who needed fixing. Not a man she was making do with. A man she had chosen out of available options, including the option of leaving. That lands on you differently than a lot of things. It stays. I built her a second room that summer. She'd said nothing about needing more space. She'd said nothing about needing anything, which was just how she was. But Daniel was sleeping in the main room, and that was going to change as he got older, and I wanted there to be a proper room for her and for him, and for whatever came after. I built it off the south side, which caught the afternoon light and stayed warm longer in winter. I put in a good window. I built the frame carefully, the way you build something you intend to last, and when it was done, I called her out to look at it, and she stood in the afternoon light and put her hand on the doorframe and didn't say anything for a minute. Then she said, "You put it on the south side." I said I did. She said, "You knew about the light." I said the south side caught the best light all the way to November. She looked at me, and there was something in her face, not surprise exactly, more like the satisfaction of a suspicion confirmed, like she'd thought this about me, and here was one more piece of evidence. She said, "I know," and she went inside to check on Daniel. That fall, two things happened that I want to tell you about. The first was Sutter's hired man. Not Sutter himself. I told you he'd left the territory, and that was true, confirmed eventually by two different people who had no reason to lie. But the hired man, whose name I learned was Casper Reed, came through Ridley in September and made some noise in the saloon about the situation at Garnet Creek and what he thought of it. I heard about this from Pollard, who relayed it with the practiced neutrality of a man who knows he's delivering information that might have consequences. I rode down to Ridley the next morning. I went to the saloon, which I had been in exactly twice before, and I found Reed at the bar. He was a lean, wind-beaten man about my age, with the look of someone who spent most of his life working for other people and nursing grudges about it. He saw me come in, and he knew who I was, and there was a moment where the bar went quiet the way bars do. I sat down next to him. I ordered coffee, because it was 9 in the morning and I had work to get back to. I said to him, conversationally, that I'd heard he had opinions about my family and my land, and I'd come to hear them directly if he had the appetite for that. He didn't say much. He said something about Sutter getting a raw deal, which I listened to. I said Sutter had paid $40 to a drunk man for a pregnant woman and had treated her poorly, and that I had no sympathy for his deal, raw or otherwise. I said that me was my wife, and the land at Garnet Creek was mine, and that anything Reed said about either of those things in public, I would hear about it, and I would come and find him, and we would have a conversation significantly less comfortable than this one. I drank my coffee, I put a coin on the bar, I rode back up the mountain. Reed left Ridley by the end of October. Pollard told me with visible disappointment, because Pollard had clearly been hoping for a more dramatic resolution. I told Pollard he read too many novels, and he didn't argue. The second thing was smaller and more important. October, late in the month. I was coming in from the eastern acreage. I'd bought it in August, 80 additional acres, and I was running fence on the far side, and it was nearly dark and cold, the kind of October cold that has winter in it and isn't pretending otherwise. I came into the cabin, and the light was in the windows the way it gets when there's a fire going and the lamps are lit, and I stopped Burl at the fence and just looked at it for a minute. The light in the windows. The smoke from the chimney going straight up in the still air. I could hear, faint through the walls, me singing something to Daniel, who was 5 months old and much more interested in the world than he'd been at the start. She sang to him in the evenings. She had a quiet, low singing voice, and she didn't perform it. She did it the way you'd do something that's just part of the end of a day. I sat on Burl in the cold dark and looked at the light in my windows, and I thought about the 40 yards of snow between the lodgepole pine and my south fence. I thought about the tracks I'd followed up the draw. I thought about a woman sitting with her back against a tree, and her lips going blue and her eyes gone past scared into something quieter, and how she'd looked at me when I got down off the horse, and what she'd been looking for in my face. I put Burl in the barn. I went inside. Me was at the table with Daniel on her knee, and she looked up when I came in and said, "Dinner's keeping," and I said, "Give me 5 minutes," and I went and washed my hands and changed my shirt and came back. We ate, Daniel fell asleep in me's arms while we were still at the table. She set him down in the cradle I'd built, a good one, solid, with rockers that actually worked, and she came back and sat across from me, and we finished eating. The fire was good. The lamp was good. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving through the pines in that low, constant way that becomes part of the silence rather than breaking it. She said, "How's the east fence going?" I said I'd have it done before the ground froze, which gave me about 3 weeks if the weather held. She said, "There's something I want to talk to you about." I said, "All right." She said, "I want to start a kitchen garden in the spring, a real one, not just what I've been doing." I said I could break that ground for her wherever she wanted it. She said she'd been thinking along the south wall of the new room, which would get the afternoon sun and be protected on the north. I said that was good thinking. She was looking at me with that direct, careful look she'd had from the beginning. She said, "I want the next 4-5 years to count for something." I said, "They'll count." She said, "I want you to know I understand what I have." I set my fork down. I looked at her. She was 24 years old, and she'd walked 11 miles in the snow on a bad ankle, and she'd built herself a life out of a situation that most people would call hopeless. And she was sitting across from me in the lamplight with her dark eyes level, and her hands flat on the table, and she was telling me, plainly, the way she did everything, that she knew what she had, that she saw it, that she was not going to take it for something ordinary. I said, "So do I." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she picked up her fork and said, "Good," and went back to eating. And the wind moved through the pines outside, and Daniel slept in his cradle, and that was the end of the conversation. But it wasn't really the end of it. It's not the kind of conversation that ends. What I know about the next years, and I'll tell you what I know without making it prettier than it was or harder than it was, is that they were years of work, and they were good years. We ran the cattle up to 60 head by the time Daniel was 3. We had a second child, a girl who we called Ruth, which me had already decided on. The kitchen garden along the south wall turned out to be productive beyond what either of us had planned. She had a way with growing things that I did not have and did not pretend to have. I provided the labor and she provided the judgment, and between those two things the garden got bigger every spring. Ridley grew some. There were new families coming in along the valley floor, and I got to know some of them, and me got to know some of their wives, and there was a kind of community beginning to form in the way communities form in places that have been empty long enough that when people start coming they come with intention. We were known in the valley. I don't know exactly when that happened. It's not the kind of thing you notice at the moment it starts, only in retrospect. But there came a point where if there was a problem with a piece of land, or a question about a fence line, or a disagreement between neighbors that needed a third party, my name got mentioned. I rode down when asked and said what I thought, and that was that. Pollard said to me once, in his way, that I had a reputation in the valley. I said I hoped it was a useful one. He said it was, which was about as direct a compliment as Pollard ever gave. I think about me saying she wanted the next 4-5 years to count for something. I think about it because she was right that they did, and because she was also the reason they did. Not because she'd made me into a different man. I was the same man, more or less, the one who'd stood in the yard with a rifle on his arm. But she'd given that man a reason to point himself at something, which is what changes the arithmetic. A capable man pointed at nothing useful is just a man passing time until he's done. A capable man with something to protect and build and someone who sees what he is, that's a different calculation entirely. That's a life. I don't have a clean way to end this. That's all right. The stories with clean endings are the ones that got finished too early. What I have is this: 160 acres that went to 240, then 300. A sound roof. A kitchen garden that in a good summer runs 40 feet along the south wall and smells like something worth coming home to. 2 children who know the land and are not afraid of work. A woman who chose this place and chose me and has never made me feel that either of those choices was a small thing. Last spring I was out on the ridge above the east fence line at the end of a long day, standing where you can see the whole of the valley below, the creek, the lower meadow, the roof of the cabin just visible through the timber, and beyond that the open country rolling south toward Ridley and the mountains above it. The light was going in that April way, gold turning toward orange. The same light me had watched from the window, back at the beginning, like it was something she was learning to expect. I stood up there for a while. I'm not a man who says much to himself on hillsides, but I thought about those tracks in the snow. The short, heavy stride, the dragging of the right boot. 11 miles, on a bad ankle in February. She'd come to the right fence,